have the great pleasure of introducing Monsieur Jean Harzic, who is our guest tonight. Jean Harzic is an emblematic figure for the world of Alliance Francaise. He's un grand homme, as we say in France. Excuse me. Yes, and if you allow me, I would also call you un enfant du monde, a child of the world. Indeed, he was born in Algiers, and then he worked in many different places around the world, and he speaks several or many, 5 different languages. You started your career as an English teacher in France, and then you worked for the CNRS, it's the National Scientific Research Center in France. Then you were a conseiller culturel in New York and then in New Zealand. And for the past 30 years, you joined the family of Alliance Francaise, and you were the first délégué général of Alliance Francaise of Paris in the United States. Thus, he became Claude's boss and his mentor, as I understood. Tonight's lecture will be about languages and culture diversity. As you all know, nowadays it is very important, not to say essential, to learn a foreign language. And learning a new language is also opening doors to a whole new world. So, Jean, we are delighted to have you here tonight.
Me too.
And we have many very curious people waiting to hear what you have to say. Je vous laisse la parole. Thank you to all of you. Enjoy et bonne soirée. Merci.
Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. After those 6 words in French, the rest will be in English. I would like to tell you that I'm very happy to be back here after spending 9 wonderful years in this country I love. I've been lucky enough to visit 47 states, several times, missing only Alaska and both Dakotas. I've come to this town 7 times. This is the 8th time. To tell you the truth, I have put up with so many boring lectures on the French language in the world, its future, or rather its absence of future, as well as about cultural diversity, pictured in an abstract way, not based on real experiences with lots of true-to-life examples, that I would like to avoid by all means to bore you stiff tonight. I would like you to leave this room with a few ideas which seem to me essential. And as it is an important topic, I'll try to speak about it without being too pompous and chauvinistic as some of my fellow countrymen can be. As you doubtless know, humor can be defined as a light way of saying serious things and serious to talk about trifles. I'll do my best to follow that principle. My remarks are also the result of what I've often heard in the 8 countries where I've lived and the 124 I have visited several times. I don't give you those figures to show off the French way, but above all because the discovery of a new language, a new culture, fills me with happiness. The 5 languages I'm lucky to speak, to write, and to understand, and the 2 I have recently started to learn, give me keys to discover other planets, other worlds, and allow me to live intensely that cultural diversity which I consider as essential and which is our topic today. I would like you to share that passion and enthusiasm with me. 2 Canadian journalists wrote recently, while the English and the North Americans conceive their language only as an instrument, a tool, for the French it is a work of art. They love it, they cherish it, for them it is a national monument. We'll see later that things are changing now thanks to the importance of utilitarianism. Today, a language being considered above all as useful, although the national monument tries to resist against wind and tide. According to Michel Serres, who is a professor in this country, any language learning implies traveling and crossbreeding. And Sioran, before living in a country, you live in its language. When I left France for my first assignment abroad, I was told repeatedly that I was going on a mission, as if I were a missionary with the task to evangelize primitive people. I was posted as Deputy Cultural Counselor in New York. Can you imagine? That was 40 years ago, and thank God the French outlook has changed a lot since we have switched from a conquering messianism, a prevailing idea for centuries in France, the country of crusades, to cultural exchanges in order not only to try and enrich the countries which welcome us, but also ours, thanks to what those countries offer us. For instance, fascinated by American literature, I wrote a book here on William Faulkner, and on a more pragmatic level, thank you, the Americans' working methods improved mine thanks to what could be called here efficiency with a smile. I love it. Yet there is no doubt that a deeply rooted principle has been instilled into the French soul, Mission to Civilize the French Way, the title of a book by an American journalist, Mort Rosenblum. Rosenblum wrote, among other remarks, "Today a subtly structured empire maintains France as a world power, one that is based firmly and squarely on illusion." And Rosenblum quoted jokingly a famous sentence by General de Gaulle, "France is the light of the world." As a matter of fact, it's far from being the only quotation. Examples abound. Victor Hugo, France, Christ of nations. Barrès, France, champion of the good in the world. Bernanos, Frenchman, if only you knew what the world expects from you. Is it really a mere illusion, according to Rosenblum? If the French language is slowly disappearing, if French is no longer indispensable, as some unhappy few seem to think, wouldn't it be absurd to keep up a strong French presence around the world, while it would be apparently useless? A clear answer may be given by the Alliance Francaise network itself. 420,000 students today in nearly 1,100 houses in 138 countries do mean something. Those many students must be seriously motivated by the study of French, otherwise they would not waste their time and, above all, their money. And I have never underestimated the importance and influence in the learning of French in other structures, public or private, schools, colleges, universities, which play a most important part. An American friend of mine teaching in a well-known university used to tell me, here people learn Spanish for practical reasons and French out of love. In many countries, like the whole of Latin America, several regions in North America, the United States and Canada, the whole of Eastern Europe, above all Romania, but also Poland, Bulgaria, Russia, French remains the language of the heart for many people. I should add that 30% of the people living in this country have a Hispanic origin, more than 15 million have French ancestors, and hundreds of thousands of people from Haiti, naturally French-speaking, live in this country. Thus, the American melting pot is a perfect example of cultural diversity if we add Russian, Italian, Asiatic communities, among many others. I often thought of the sentence Simone de Beauvoir wrote just after the Second World War. The United States are one of the rare places in the world where the future of man is at stake. The same thing could be said about Alliance Francaise and also languages like Spanish and French. For centuries, my fellow countrymen remained convinced that the only way to convey our culture and our creativity was the French language, almost sacralized, as we have seen. Hence the enormous importance given to the written language, to books and to literature, to lectures always given in French, never in Spanish or in English, because it was felt like a betrayal. I refused to be an official lecturer, as they were called between the two wars, because I wished to feel free to praise and to criticize. It was only recently that we became aware that sounds, pictures, colors, forms, movements can also convey French culture, reasonably proud this time of its dance, music, photographs, architecture, and above all its movies, which are exported successfully. Yet we have not neglected the heart of the mission, which remains the teaching of French, the primary goal of every alliance, because at the same time it is not superfluous to earn some money to invest it in order to improve the alliance. Without forgetting Mark Twain's advice, the advantage of money is that it helps put up with poverty. However, many alliances have become important cultural centers where various cultures are carefully blended, a fine example of cultural diversity. The great success worldwide of the Fête de la Musique seems to be the best proof. Incidentally, it's a play on words. Fête de la musique, from the verb faire, make music, and also fête, feast, festival. Thousands of people who play music, others who sing and dance on June the 21st in hundreds of towns, all that does make sense. It is a popular feast, far from traditional cliché of elitist Frenchmen. It is a feast conceived and imagined by the French thanks to another language, music. French tunes are echoed by Caribbean, North and South American, Indian music. Exchange is a key word opposed to messianism. We could write in golden letters on the door of each alliance what Pedro Osorio, who was director of the House of Latin America in Paris, used to say to his French friends, mostly writers in the 30s. We wish that every linguistic or cultural action of yours in our countries should be carried out as we feel it necessary. Your action should never impose upon us what you feel best, but be adapted to our wishes. We alone, Latin Americans, can organize your own program in our countries. That exchange is a dialogue of cultures, or rather the exchange of giving and receiving, as the Senegalese poet Senghor, who was also a statesman, used to say. I would like to give you a minor example, but one which makes sense to my mind. I have endeavored to offer the best of my culture and my mother tongue. By the way, aren't we lucky to welcome so many young women among our students of French, not only for the pleasure of the eyes, but because the language is transmitted mostly thanks to women. One says mother tongue and not father tongue. But at the same time, I learned Spanish thanks to classes given at the Alliance Francaise in Argentina, where I was posted in Buenos Aires, and Portuguese in Brazil, in Rio. Today, it is possible to learn Malgache in Madagascar, in our network of Alliance Francaise, Thai in Bangkok, and of course English in many countries. In other words, we give French, we receive the local language. Diversity starts there. There are symbolical examples in a way because they give a proof of the respect at the heart of this kind of exchange for the language spoken in the country which welcomes us, including rare and difficult languages like Bulgarian, Chinese or Japanese. I'm not claiming that my fellow countrymen are gifted for foreign languages, far from it, but at least many of them seem to have understood that speaking only one language is just as bad as being familiar with one single culture. One is locked up in one's village instead of being open to the global village, in other words, to the world. Now today, what is it all about? The first basic, obvious, unquestionable fact is that English is a universal language. Nowadays, someone who is not perfectly at ease in the computer world and in the English language is offside and even out. In such a case, communicating worldwide is practically impossible. Many Frenchmen fear the invasion of our language by English. I entirely agree with the former French Prime Minister, Alain Juppé, because I love English, when he wrote that to fight against English would be stupid and would lead us to a complete failure. We must keep a linguistic and cultural plurality which seems necessary for ourselves but also for our partners. End of his quotation. I'll point out that the invasion of German by a profusion of English words is probably even stronger. Eine Homepage, eine Performance, fit sein, to be fit. among scores of others. And yet the German language has not lost 1 ounce of its identity. Like French, it borrows words to become richer and is by no means invaded by them. Many Germans will say, nach meinem Job will ich joggen, like many Frenchmen, such as our President of the Republic. Après mon job, je vais faire mon jogging. Job, jogging. In Mexico, you won't say alquilar to translate to rent, but rentar from to rent, as well as checar from to check, a proof that some English words are easily naturalized, like in Portuguese, o time, T-I-M-E, from team, o time verde e amarelo, the green and yellow team, the national selection in soccer. The Brazilians are very good. I admire Spanish and Portuguese because they can naturalize English words without any problem. To rent becomes rentar in Spanish. A team becomes time in Portuguese. On the other hand, a great number of French words have spread in all languages, sometimes visible, sometimes concealed. A few months ago, I was in Poland. A young girl told me, my friend over there has a nice bardotka, talking about her friend's bra. Where did our national Brigitte Bardot nestle? In a bra. When some Poles talk about de Golovka, they refer to the peaked cap worn by General de Gaulle, who was not a movie actor, but a theatrical statesman on the political world scene. Bardot, Brigitte Bardot, bardotka in Polish. De Gaulle, de Golovka. In Russia, a Belmondo is a man who, like the French actor, is convinced he's handsome and irresistible. Once in St. Petersburg, I heard the feminine Belmonda to talk about a beautiful, alluring woman. A Russian asked me, have you spoken to that beautiful Belmonda? Belmonda. In Romania, an Alain Delon is a coat similar to the one worn by the actor in the movie by Visconti in the 60s, Rocco and His Brothers. Alain Delon is a coat. Those examples show that our cinema, and above all French actors, are good exports and have influenced several languages in Eastern Europe. In Russian, various French words have been adopted, like marche-route, which doesn't exist in French but means walk the road. Recently in Ukraine, where I spent 3 or 4 weeks, I was asked many times what was my marche-route, in other words, my itinerary. A few weeks ago in Guadalajara, a Mexican took me by the arm and told me, vamos al ambigu. I knew it was a buffet because in France in the 18th century one could eat, drink, dance and sing in an ambigu, as it was called at the time. Besides the well-known musicians, Mexican musicians called mariachi, generally play in official or intimate celebrations, for instance in weddings. The notice, mariage ici, wedding here, put by Maximilian's troops, became mariage ici, mariachi. Mariage ici, mariachi. All you need is love, used to sing the Beatles, and it is commonplace to recall that love, most often unlawful, we have that reputation wrongly or rightly, as well as gastronomy, are the two fields in which borrowed French words are particularly numerous in most languages. In some cases, both pleasures are combined. For instance, in German, ein Baiser doesn't mean a kiss, like in French, but a cake called meringue. In Spanish, un bonbon is a chocolate derived from the French bonbon, a candy, while es un bonbon, when talking about a girl, means she's a sweetie. In Argentina, a pretty girl is un budín, curiously enough from the French boudin, blood sausage, while un boudin in Paris means that the girl is very ugly. Beautiful in Buenos Aires, ugly in Paris. In several English-speaking countries, one talks about affair, liaison, intrigue, femme fatale, and many more. Italians, who have nothing to learn from their French neighbors in that respect, have adopted garçonnière, bachelor's flat, and pied-à-terre, an apartment ready to receive as many girls as possible. If French has, according to other people, a taste for sin, it also has values of understatement. Thus, rendezvous, a very ordinary appointment, is much more romantic, pronounced the English way, rendezvous, in London or New York, but also in Germany, where tête-à-tête is even more intimate, ein cavalier, with a K and not a C like in French, being a gentleman. In Western Germany, around Cologne, some people talk about caressant, with a K, tender, fond, affectionate. Here again, with that K, to describe a womanizer. They also have created a word which sounds French but doesn't exist in our language, caressage, a German word coined from the French language meaning an affair. In Germany, the word Fisimatenten means what we would call in English smirks and smiles. Napoleon's soldiers used to say to charming blonde German girls, "Voulez-vous visiter ma tente? Would you like to visit my tent?" The equivalent of what a gentleman would say today to attract a lady to his apartment, "Would you like to see my Japanese print room?" There again, visiter ma tante became in German Fisimatenten and created a new word. Perhaps that's the reason why in Peru, the Alliance Francaise chose to print a poster as an ad to learn French with a picture of a very pretty girl with the following sentence underneath. Si te gustaron los labios, imagina cómo será la lengua. If you liked the lips, imagine how the tongue will be. It surprised and even scandalized some people in the upper middle class, but never had an Alliance Francaise in Latin America welcomed so many men. Apparently, the ad was very successful, particularly among males. Finally, it will be much too long to quote most words the French language is given to the table and to the kitchen, gourmet being a universal word as well as dozens of others. Thus, the barbecue, as well as la barbacoa, south of the Rio Grande, and also used in the Caribbean, are derived from de la barbe à la queue, from the beard to the tail of the animal that is being roasted. De la barbe à la queue, barbecue, barbacoa. If you find in Germany a loaf of thick black bread called der Pumpernickel, bear in mind that Napoleon's soldiers, when they saw it, were rather disgusted and said, "C'est bon pour nickel, it's good for nickel, Napoleon's horse." Pronounced the German way, bon pour nickel became pour nickel, Pumpernickel in German. A very common sentence in German is das Brot ist alle, there's no more bread, or das Benzin ist alle, there's no petrol left. It comes from the French aller, because a French Protestant who had emigrated to Berlin used to say, "C'en est allé," it's gone, when a customer asked for one of his products. The other day, I was recently in the Ukraine, in Odessa, by the Black Sea, where I asked repeatedly, ikra, 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 caviar, 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 which is very cheap and very good. I saw on the card a dessert called Napoleon, like in several English-speaking countries, called in French un millefeuille, literally 1,000 leaves. Some people say that it was the emperor's favorite dessert, but others say jokingly that there are so many pages in the penal code named after him, Code Napoleon, that a cake was also named after him, Napoleon. What conclusion can we draw from those surprising, often funny and unexpected examples? First and foremost, the fact that the word keeps its original concept, bon viveur, in several languages, like Versal, W-E-R-S-A-L, from the castle at Versailles, to express the idea of elegant in some languages in Eastern Europe, linked to what the French are usually credited with, the art of living, the pleasures, all the pleasures of life, elegance, good taste, genuine or not. In a recent issue of the magazine of the Federation in the United States, I was glad to read, like many of my fellow countrymen, this: how the French invented high fashion, fine food, Chic cafes, by the way, the word chic is used in several languages. Style, sophistication, and grammar. Probably inspired by those ideas, the Germans have coined another word which doesn't exist in French, raffinesse, from raffiner, refined, and finesse, subtlety, what they imagine in the French personality. Right or wrong, it doesn't matter. It's good for our image and our reputation. As the French writer Céline wrote, the fight against the myths of the time has become impossible. Myths defend themselves too well. One can say that the linguistic crossbreeding is an enrichment for all the languages we have influenced, and also for French, which has welcomed many influences. It is a strength and certainly not a weakness. As another contemporary French writer, Le Clésio, wrote, I can understand why I'm happy with the French language, not because it is the most beautiful or logical or crystal clear, but because under its varnish of balance and stability, I can hear other languages. There are two characteristics with which everybody seems to agree: musical beauty and balance, stability. That musicality may be due to the fact that words in French are linked by the liaison. Les hommes, not les hommes. Les hommes, les arbres, and not les arbres. A French linguist used to say that words embrace each other. Several teachers of French in various Alliance Francaise in Latin American countries told their students, talking about embrace, do not forget, in order to pronounce correctly U, I, E, two difficult sounds, to perfect your kisses. You will speak French well if you can kiss well. One day I was in the capital of Ghana, Accra, for the inauguration of the local Alliance Francaise, and I thanked warmly the mayor who had donated a huge plot of land in the heart of the city on which 2 houses had been built thanks to a grant from the French government in order to teach French. I asked him why he had been so generous. He answered me, for 2 reasons. The first one is that I adore France for its quality of life and also its humanistic principles. Besides, look at a map. We are surrounded by French-speaking countries. Therefore, your language is useful to us, and I should even add indispensable. It is the second language on this continent, and almost the whole of West Africa speaks French. In that statement, I found the 2 main motives why French is learnt worldwide: affectivity, the language of the heart, and utilitarianism, because it can be useful in many fields. According to the English historian Zeldin, it's not enough for a language to be beautiful, it must also be useful. If English-speaking Africa, Ghana, but also Kenya, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Tanzania is very much interested in French, it is due to the fact that French Africa appears like a market those countries are looking for. I often ask Chinese in mainland China, but also in Hong Kong and Taiwan, as well as people in Singapore, Malaysia, and even India, 14 Alliance, the largest network in Asia, why so many of them are learning French. The answer was the same everywhere. We all speak English, but we do need to speak French too if we want to trade with Africa. That's also the reason why there are so many French classes generally organized by the local Alliance Francaise called French at your desk in English-speaking countries in business concerns. In Madrid, the Alliance teaches French in 33 firms, 100 in London, 33 in Bangkok. Any language wishing to be international but sure that it's useful even if it can appeal for other reasons. Recently appeared in our country a strong link between French and economy, which was not obvious for the Latin Catholics that we are. In the south of Brazil, in Curitiba, Renault has started making cars in a factory where everybody is learning French thanks to the local Aliança Franco-Brasileira. In France, no one seems shocked to see everywhere bar à tapas or happy hour from 5 to 6 p.m. If one is creative, imaginative, words follow naturally. It's by no means an invasion but rather the adoption of two very nice customs, one from Spain and the other one from the United States. If we go too far in setting up walls and defenses around the French language, we run the risk of reaching dangerous purity, as the French writer Bernard-Henri Lévy calls it. An idea which is to me essential is the following. Babel is in no way a curse, but indeed a blessing. When I said that a few months ago in Haiti, 3 students stood up and shouted, "Sir, you are against the Bible, against God, against Jesus." Then I saw across the street in front of the open-air theater where I was speaking a bar called Jesus Alive. I tried to explain quietly that it was not a religious but a linguistic problem. There exists a universal language, English, which remains an essential tool of communication used everywhere in the world, but linguistic plurality is vital if we want to keep preciously what makes the richness of our world diversity. The fact that 3,000 languages are threatened with extinction before the end of this century is as serious, in my opinion, as an ecological disaster. Among them, several of the 56 Indian languages spoken in Mexico. We must consider as a great victory for all nations the vote by the UNESCO in October 2005 of an agreement about the protection and the promotion of cultural and linguistic diversity. That convention states literally, the cultural activities, goods and services must not be treated as having only a commercial value. I should add that the linguistic standardization would be the starting point of a serious intellectual impoverishment. One single language implies one single thought. If the computer language is neutral, it's entirely different in the case of a living language. Everyone looks at the world in a unique way because of the language he speaks. That's what the German linguist Humboldt calls Weltanschauung, or vision of the world. Take 2 languages generally considered as very near, Spanish and French. Spanish-speaking people use 3 words depending on the distance in space and also in time. Este, this, very near, esta mesa. Esse, which is a bit far away, and laquelle, even further away. While French uses only 1, ce, and English 2, this and that. It implies that space and time, 2 essential concepts in man's life, are not conceived the same way according to the language chosen. The outlook upon the world is entirely different if you describe it in Spanish, in English, or in French. Hector Bianchiotti, the Argentine writer who lives in France and writes in French, is right. 2 words as close as la soledad in Spanish and la solitude in French, loneliness, are entirely different. The Spanish word la soledad, just like the Portuguese a soledad, seems to shut at the end. The French word with that long syllable, la solitude, which seems to have no end, is open and more disturbing. Loneliness seems much worse in French than in Spanish or in Portuguese. Fellini has often pointed out that his movies would have been completely different if they had been shot in English and not in Italian. All European filmmakers who worked in Hollywood have produced different works according to the language chosen for the shooting. I was amazed in the good movie about Schindler's List to hear the Nazis speak English. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I used to listen to the BBC during the war with my parents. I barely understood hardly half of it, but for me at the time, English was the language of freedom, German the language of oppression. From that standpoint, TV5, watched in French by 170 million homes, and Radio France Internationale offer a different and therefore original vision as compared to other televisions and radios. Besides, a great number of readers in all fields, cultural, political, diplomatic, or even economic, speak English naturally, in addition to their mother tongue, and more often than is generally believed, French as well. As far as I know, not a single journalist in Afghanistan asked the men belonging to the Alliance of the North, nothing to do with our Alliance Francaise, As you doubtless know, it was a military alliance fighting the Taliban. How can you explain that you speak perfect French? For more than 10 years, as leaders of the guerrilla in the mountains, their main occupation was certainly not to read French novels and to learn French grammar. The answer would have been obvious. The French lycée in Kabul, one among over 100 worldwide, welcomed more than 3,000 students, thus training the future managerial staff. In many countries which have been through the ups and downs of history, such as Romania and Bulgaria, among many others, at the time of the Iron Curtain, there are still many people who speak excellent French, thanks to a very extensive network of schools, colleges, lycées, Alliance. If Walter Salles, the Brazilian film director, Jodie Foster, Woody Allen, and so many others, more or less famous, speak fluent French, it is due to a huge network of lycées, French institute and cultural centers, over 150, run by the French government, and almost 1,100 Alliance Francaise, run by people who most often are not French, but committed Francophiles. Woody Allen once said, "The French are incredible linguists." That was very kind of him, because I don't agree with him. The French are incredible linguists. Even their children speak French. One day I happened to be at the French lycée in New York in one of the upper classes, and I saw a girl who was the very picture of Lauren Bacall. I told her, and she replied in perfect French, "She's my mother." Proof that many French-speaking people encourage their children to do the same, to speak French, because Lauren Bacall's daughter spoke perfect French. I keep repeating to my fellow countrymen, if you want other people to learn French, tell them in another language, preferably one that is widespread, like English or even Spanish, which is gaining ground even in the north. A few years ago, not far from the Canadian border, near Seattle, the gentleman at the reception desk in my hotel, in answer to, "I've got a reservation in the name of Harzic, H-A-R-Z-I-C, asked me, "Usted no hablaría español por casualidad? You wouldn't speak Spanish by any chance?" It so happened that I did, but I was amazed because it was not in Miami or in San Diego, but in the extreme north of the United States. Some progress has been made in France in the teaching and learning of foreign languages, but a lot remains to be done if we want to avoid misunderstandings like this one. On board a liner somewhere in the Atlantic between Europe and the United States, at the same table sit an Englishman who doesn't speak one word of French and a Frenchman who speaks broken English, naturally, nothing unusual. The first evening, the Frenchman turns up late for dinner and says, "Bon appétit." The Englishman seems surprised, stands up and replies, "Robinson." The next evening, the same thing happens. "Bon appétit, Robinson." The next day, "Bon appétit, Robinson." After a few days, the Englishman decides to ask a waiter for an explanation. "There is a strange chap sitting at my table. He will turn up late every evening. He's a Frenchman, and you know how some frogs can be rather rude people. And he will insist upon introducing himself every time. His name is Mr. Bon Appetit. I consider myself as a gentleman, and therefore I have to reciprocate. My name is Robinson." And now, in spite of my English self-control, it's getting a bit on my nerves. How can you explain that? The waiter gives him the meaning of bon appétit, good appetite, in other words, enjoy your meal. The Englishman exclaims, "Oh, splendid! Now you know 2 words of French." And he repeats everywhere on board the ship, "Bon appétit, bon appétit, bon appétit." The same evening he arrives late for dinner in his turn, and he says with a praiseworthy effort, "Bon appétit." The Frenchman stands up and says, "Robinson." Now let's sum up the main points. A universal and indispensable language, English, but at the same time, the absolute necessity to encourage people to be multilingual. If one gives priority to Spanish, German, Portuguese, Italian, Russian, rather than to French, it's not a treason, but a personal or professional choice which should be respected. We are very lucky to get the help of many people who are not French, but friends of our country. The former president of the Federation in the United States, Steve Cobb, used to say, "We don't want to be junior partners." A remark to the point which I've heard in other countries, for instance in England and New Zealand. Our partners are never second class, far from it, and my fellow countrymen should bear in mind that French is alive and well thanks to, not to the French, but to other people. Today, 68 countries belong to what is called Francophonie, the community of French-speaking countries. It's not a negligible figure. Nations one expected are to be found in that important group, many African countries in the west of the continent, Canada, Belgium, Switzerland, but also others quite unexpected, which are a pleasant surprise, Egypt, Romania, Nigeria, Zimbabwe. Such a large network has a great weight among nations. The aim is to promote the use and the spreading of the French language in the world, but at the same time to be an instrument of development in the southern countries. Such is the statement written by several French-speaking people to explain what Francophonie is. A Canadian, Michel Venn, explains, "I'm from Quebec, and for me living close to the American giant, Francophonie means a hope, the hope that my language will still develop in the world, living, able to name reality, all reality, without any intermediaries or translators. It's the means to have access to the global village and to express in my language my vision of mankind." Salas Tétier, the Lebanese writer, made the following statement: "Francophonie is a culture, a civilization, a way of life, a human community, everything being united by the practice and the love of the French language." A statement in Croatia said, "To support Francophonie in our country means to move forward a plural and humanistic Europe." We must bear in mind that 120 million people use French as the first language in the world, 150 million as a second language, while 100 million pupils and students learn French as a foreign language with the help of 900,000 teachers. An important element to be attracted by a language is, after utilitarianism, seduction, which comes first, and enticement. The Canadian journalist and writer Denise Bombardier wrote in her last book, "France seduces thanks to the savoir-faire and savoir-vivre of the French. France may have made errors in the past, but she remains in the imagination of the whole world a country which is magic, complex and brilliant. That France delights me." End of quotation. Besides, I would like to add another essential element today, tourism, which has increased in spite of the disaster of September 11th. When 78 million people visited France last year, putting it number one in the world, the consequences were not only favorable financially, but also linguistically. There is more and more a strong link between tourism and the language of the country that is being visited. Many new classes have been created in lots of Alliance Francaise, such as Brush Up Your French, Cursos Acelerados, or Crash Course, even in Australia with French for Tourism, where over 300,000 people decided to travel to France 2 years ago. The main purpose is to be able to communicate in daily life. Every time in Paris, North Americans and also Australians, Brazilians, Italians, Germans asked me to show them their way. They always spoke in French, most often good French, a proof they had prepared their trip cautiously. Closely linked to what we have just seen, there is also an interest more difficult to define, the power of the dream. For the past 2 centuries, and even today, for a big part of mankind, that dream is to be found somewhere between Manhattan and San Francisco. Millions of people try to emigrate towards the United States because of the American dream. Without comparing France with this country because of its size, its power, its influence, there is no doubt that France, and particularly Paris, are very attractive for lots of reasons, whatever the turmoil, sometimes violent, as we have experienced recently. Whatever may happen, the German judgment has still many fans in the world. Glücklich wie Gott in Frankreich, happy like God in France. As the English historian Zeldin already quoted put it, France must insist on its quality of life. It is known as such worldwide, and that is the reason why it's the country which attracts most tourists. As for Bronislaw Gemek, the former Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, he added, France remains a center of cultural and artistic appeal for Europe and also for the rest of the world. In the north of Mexico, from Tijuana and Mexicali in the west, not far from the Pacific, to Saltillo and Monterrey in the east, all students told me that if they learned French, it was because they considered that language as a key to have access to Europe, starting with France. All that we have seen explains why many alliances have their doors wide open to humanism. Last time I went to Pakistan, I saw the facade of the Alliance Francaise building in Karachi, which had just been machine-gunned simply because men and women were chatting quietly and innocently over a cup of coffee, a mortal sin for many of those Muslims. The only place in Pakistan where men and women can get together in public is the garden of the Alliance. I asked the director what he intended to do after such a cruel attack which had caused casualties, and he answered me as if it were obvious, I wish to carry on like this because if we do not, that would imply the death of our moral principles. When I was posted in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, during a contest at the Alliance Francaise to win a plane ticket to France and a stay in Paris, a girl from the town of Cordoba exclaimed on the stage, "For me, French is the language of freedom." That was during the military dictatorship. The audience, approximately 300 people, stood up and gave a loud applause for 15 minutes. The next day I was summoned at the military police, where the colonel properly told me off, saying that it was scandalous to talk about freedom in such circumstances. I reminded him that in the national anthem of his country, the word was repeated 3 times, libertad, 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 freedom, freedom, freedom. Therefore, in countries as widely different as Pakistan and Argentina, as well as in many more, we defend humanistic principles when democracy does not exist anymore. I would like to borrow my conclusion from one of my close friends, the president of the Mexican Federation of Alliance Francaise in Mexico, Señor Agustín Legorreta, because many presidents around the world could say the same thing. I do not work for France, although I love it. I work for us Mexicans. 36,000, of course he was not talking about the Mexican population, but the students' enrollment last year. He added, the French language and culture are the best instruments I know to open the minds of many of our fellow countrymen, not only because it increases their ability to communicate, but also because French culture was the source of democracy and has contributed to modern technology, which in many cases is as good as in other nations and often better. Thus, we won't know the fate of the English when their linguists landed in Australia long after the first explorers. Those, when they saw animals carrying their little ones in a pocket and leaping about, asked the natives, "What do you call these strange-looking animals?" The answer was kangaroo, and the linguists discovered that the 3 words kangaroo meant, "I don't understand a word of what you are talking about." The same funny misunderstanding occurred in Mexico when the first Spanish navigators landed and asked the natives they met on the beach, "¿Cómo se llama esta tierra? What do you call this land?" And the answer was Yucatan, which became, for the Spaniards, the large peninsula in the Atlantic Ocean, capital Mérida. Yucatan meant "no entiendo ni una palabra," I don't understand a word, in the local Maya language. Oddly enough, there is a strong link between kangaroos and Yucatan. Besides, as the Mayas were very hospitable people, they offered a bowl of a burning liquid unknown to the Spaniards. They imported it and made it known to the whole of Europe. Thus, chocolate was discovered in most countries in Europe, while linguists found out that chocolate meant cuidado, está muy caliente. Careful, it's very hot. Thank you for your attention and your patience. I'm ready to answer your questions if there are any, and of course, if I know the replies. Thank you. Oui. C'est un enrichissement de la langue. C'est un enrichissement de la langue. La langue adopte des mots venus de l'étranger pour s'enrichir et devenir encore plus vivante. L'anglais a adopté comme ça beaucoup de mots. Le français aussi, comme je disais tout à l'heure, job et jogging, qui sont des mots tout à fait courants en français. Et on retrouve cela dans la plupart des langues, en espagnol, en allemand, en italien, etc. Donc c'est... Oui.
Anyone understand French? Or should we translate?
Everybody understands French, I'm sure. En anglais. Oui. D'accord. Anything else in English?
A question maybe about the treaty you mentioned that was signed at UNESCO. It's a very important one, although you did not dwell on it. How easy to get to? It's usually not easy to have a treaty with the United Nations or UNESCO. How easy was it to get the various countries to agree in such a treaty?
Everybody agreed.
A real agreement.
Everybody agreed, yeah. And a treaty which is enforced. Yes.
I have a question based on early 1900s. There was an attempt to establish the Esperanto movement to try to have some type of a uniform or embraceable by the entire world community, a language which everyone could adopt as a central focus.
Yes.
What is, in your linguistic...
It was fabricated. It was not like a language which has its history, and therefore today I don't believe that many people speak Esperanto.
No, I understand that they don't, but do you think that in the future that there will be some attempt to...
No, I'm not in favor of Esperanto. I believe it's artificial, purely and simply artificial.
And we like to think of Quebec as the foyer de la Francophonie nord-américaine. And in addition, so that celebration on you. But my question is that we are going to work on the Sommet de la Francophonie next fall in 2008. And I would like to know if you would agree to extend the family of the Francophonie to a state such as Louisiana, where you have the population fighting for the...
Many people speak French in Louisiana. Very peculiar French, and sometimes can't understand a word, but it's very nice and old-fashioned. That's it. Thank you very much.
One more.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. One thing that struck me after 25 years in America is the following situation. The immense majority of Americans have great difficulties in understanding that it can be a benefit to talk any foreign language. It doesn't matter whether it is French or German or Spanish. Even Spanish, for instance, which would be a natural second language today in the United States, you meet a strong resistance because of the very notion, what's the use of learning any foreign language?
In several towns in the United States, I spoke in Spanish and in French. Everyone understood.
Congratulations, that was in a, let's say it was rather concentrated.
Yes, right. Thank you and good night.